Welcome everyone to this great event. I really enjoy this every year, and in fact, I've occasionally come actually also as a scientist to these meetings over the years, and talked about software development and how that might relate to in the Industrial Partner Program and so on. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be back here as NCSA Director. I don't know if you know my history. I know many of you, but perhaps not all of you. I came here about a year and a half ago, from a place called the Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology in Russia. And I was there as the Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation. Now, I'll have you a slide on that to explain a little bit more about what that was all about. But the key concept was exactly what Merle has been talking about here this morning, about how you would build a university that was geared specifically for innovation as well as for discovery in a convergent environment. And in fact, my responsibility there was to create 15 things that we called CREIs, C-R-E-I, Centers for Research, Education, and Innovation. And R-E and I, Research, Education, and Innovation, were what we referred to as the triple helix. That is, they were inextricably bound together in a convergent fashion like what Merle was talking about. And in every one of these centers, we would have scientists from different disciplines, and we'd have engineers, and we'd have companies, and we'd have students all working together to drive innovation, in this case for Russia. But I think the concept is excellent, and in fact, that's very much my mission for the University of Illinois and for NCSA specifically. So that's just a little prelude to what it is that I'll be telling you about. So let me just start off by giving you just a snapshot. This is like the one-slide snapshot of where NCSA is today. So NCSA has been around for 3 decades. This is, I guess, is this exactly the 30th year? I can't remember. Is the 30th year of NCSA? Something like that. It's very close to 30 years, 3 decades anyway. And so it was one of the 5 NSF-funded supercomputing centers from the very beginning. And in fact, some of you will know Larry Smarr. Larry was a very bold and brash young assistant professor with a $14,000 grant in the astronomy department. And he's like, I can't do my work. I need supercomputers. So he wrote a $35 million unsolicited proposal to the National Science Foundation and says, basically, it's unacceptable, the situation we have in this country. We need to do things like this. And so NSF turned around and funded these 5 centers, in fact, with NCSA being one of them. And then Larry said, this is actually not just for research, this is also for innovation, this is for industry. And Larry and John Stevenson took out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal and said, we're open for business, for American competitiveness. And so this is the kind of bold action that this university and NCSA has had a history of doing for years. And so I'm here to tell you that NCSA has still got that bold vision and bold leadership, and it has a lot of capacity, and we're thinking even bigger about what we can do in the future. So over the years, NCSA has brought over $1 billion to the university through federal grants, and largely through federal grants, very, very large ones, as you can tell. In fact, the Blue Water System, which is in that building on the right, and if you haven't seen it, you'll have a chance to see it later today, and that system is about $345 million in funding. So it's a very, very large computer with an amazing set of expert staff who know every aspect of it, with partnerships with Cray, and other vendors, very, very deep partnerships, Cray being the primary integrator for this, and it's a fantastic instrument for doing science and discovery and innovation. We also manage the national cyber infrastructure, if you could call it that, through a project called EXCEED, the Extreme Science and Engineering environment for stitching together services that go across all of the national supercomputing centers, and increasingly building bridges to campuses with industrial partners, with data services being developed, and so on, and connecting into the very large instruments that NSF also funds. So that's a $145 million project over 5 years, and we've just been asked to submit a proposal to renew that for another 5 years, and that is all about digital services. That doesn't have any resources with it aside from people, which is the most important resource. But it's not about funding supercomputers and things. It's about providing the services and funding the people to support the science and engineering communities that take advantage of them at a national level. And of course, the private sector program, which is vigorously active and growing. So that's a snapshot. So I would say, and when I came here, some of the other center directors around the country wrote me nice letters and said NCSA is at the top of its game. You know, so we're seen as the place, I think, nationally, but we have good partnerships with other centers as well. So so we have both a leadership role and I think a very strong collaborative role with other sites across the country. So that's kind of a snapshot of where we are. So now, I want to talk a little bit about some of my experiences. So, of course, I was a vice president for research in Russia. I was at the National Science Foundation for 4 years, where I had a bird's eye view. I oversaw 2 units there. One was the Directorate for Math and Physical Sciences, and within that, the divisions of physics, chemistry, materials, astronomy, and mathematics. So you really get a sense for what are the trends in science and engineering. And we saw ourselves as the MPS, Math and Physical Sciences Directorate, as what we called ourselves, the foundation of the foundation, the most fundamental research areas within the National Science Foundation, but that was key to being the building blocks for innovation. So we had these taglines, but it was very, very strongly aimed at supporting innovation in the country. And in fact, there was a program that I helped initiate there called I-Corps. Some of you might have heard of it, for the Innovation Corps, which was to give small supplements to NSF grantees if their research programs might possibly lead to commercialization of new products and so on. And in fact, you might have thought that some of the mathematicians or the physicists would say, you know, we're not interested in doing that, but it turned out that MPS was the most successful in developing those kinds of projects. So in fact, there's a lot of perhaps changed thinking about the importance of the fundamental sciences and how physicists and mathematicians and material scientists and chemists actually are really worried about what's relevant societally, and there's a lot of interest in moving communities in that direction. And NCSA will be a place that will draw on the strengths of this great university and funnel them in and sort of bridge that gap that Merle was talking about. So I'll come to that. So that's a sort of an overview of the next couple of points, but that we see these 2 trends now in science and engineering. One is that we're going from the great individual scientists to teams. And my background is gravitational physics. And so there's a long history for hundreds of years of great individuals doing work but not really working in teams very much until about the last 2 decades. So even in general relativity, where you have this history for centuries of people working in isolation, suddenly you have large teams. And that's a team that I actually helped lead in Europe called the EU Astrophysics Network. That brought together research groups across 10 countries to solve complex problems in astrophysics. And as I'll show you in a minute, they're just one step away from the kinds of complex problems many of you are working on as well. So that's one trend. The idea that you have to bring together expertise from multiple directions in order to solve any complex problem. That was basically what Merle was telling you about. And the other one is, of course, the technologies and the data systems and the computing systems are growing ever larger, and they're becoming incredibly complicated and more difficult to use. So therefore, you need the people who understand how to use them, who are experts in adapting them for different kinds of problems, as well as the technologies themselves. So this spans everything from a big new telescope that's generating or will be generating hundreds of petabytes of data over time, to systems like Blue Waters, to, on the right-hand side, a thing called the Materials Genome Initiative, where there was this great idea that if you could provide materials data and software and experimental facilities and theory sort of all on an equal footing, and provide that information not only from individual research groups to other individual research groups, but also to industry, you could accelerate discovery. So you could take discovery and cut the time down by half, and then make the actual the devices that the material science underlies at half the cost. So cutting the time to development down by half and then making it cost half as much as well. That was sort of a tagline for that program that actually came out of the White House, but it was something very important at the National Science Foundation, at the DOE, at NIST, and other agencies. And so there's a lot of thinking of this materials genome initiative that's in everything we're trying to do here at NCSA as well. So just to give you an idea what's happened in astrophysics, which is my background, but I'm not going to go into the details of black hole collisions, but I'm going to just point out that this group of scientists from 10 different countries actually developed a software environment called the Einstein Toolkit based on the cactus simulation framework. And the idea there was that the equations you have in general relativity, which are hyperbolic, elliptic, parabolic, they're basically anything you've got out there in industry, we've got them there in spades, and even more complicated. So developing a software framework that would allow people to solve complex problems, complex PDEs, if it's useful for Einstein's equations, it's going to be useful for other companies who do anything to do with fluid dynamics as well. But this has actually had a tremendous impact in the field of relativity because it's allowed people for the first time to solve Einstein's equations after a century. They were developed by Einstein in 1915 and nobody could solve them, not Einstein, not Stephen Hawking, no one, until the last decade when suddenly, due to computational science, any graduate student can now solve them with software toolkits that have been developed that are open and shareable. But individual groups sometimes have specific needs to, like for example, a group at the University of Illinois might share a software environment with other groups like at Caltech, but there are certain projects where they're not going to share their particular modules in this. And so they want to use it for their competitive advantage, but they see it in their global advantage to actually work together at some level. For example, on the message passing or the I/O or the visualization modules and so on. So there's sort of a framework that allows people to both compete and to collaborate with each other. And Merle had a meeting here about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe it's 7 years ago now, on software. And we had these discussions, and a number of you were at this meeting. I remember it very clearly because it's very inspirational to me, about how software frameworks could potentially be an advantage, a competitive advantage for many of your companies, as well as a sort of a collaboration vehicle as well, because it's too complicated for any one small group to be able to do this stuff. You need to have the critical mass that Merle was talking about. So there's a potential discussion over the next year what we might try to do in the software area. But this is an example, like a worked example of how it's worked in a very viciously competitive academic environment. And you know, Henry Kissinger made this great comment about why it is that the fights in academia are so vicious. It's because the stakes are so low, okay? So you all have higher stakes, but you also fight with each other as well as work together. And I think that's a beautiful kind of example of something we can help you with on the working together part in particular. All right, so let me go on. So this is just an example now what a particular group at Caltech can do using this framework. So suddenly they're able to solve Einstein's equations and add in all kinds of multi-physics. They can add in fluid dynamics, they can add in magnetic fields, neutrinos, radiation transport, nuclear equations of state, and so on. And they can run these things with adaptive mesh refinement on machines like Blue Waters at scales of hundreds of thousands of cores to do science that just was unthinkable even just a few years ago. And so this is just an example. Smaller groups can leverage these sort of larger community efforts in order to do this. And that's the main point I want to make from this slide. And these are beautiful visualizations of the first three-dimensional core collapse calculations that actually have all of those ingredients in them. And new phenomena were discovered in doing these simulations. Now, fluids, and I learned this from Tom Lang, I think I saw Tom out there somewhere. Fluids are, of course, both relativistic and in our everyday lives. And so we all have to worry about multi-physics. You know, many of your companies are thinking about multi-physics environments, and you have to get the physics right. Not just to do an idealized calculation, but something that really is something you deal with in the real world, right? So the bottom line is that when you do things like large-scale simulations on Blue Waters, you need all this technology, and it's good for software, for astrophysics, and for fluid flow in porous media. So, another example, and this is another one that Merle mentioned a minute ago, was what Klaus Schulten is doing. So on a machine like Blue Waters, and again, Klaus uses software developed in part by Sanjay Kalei, who is one of the industrial private sector partners now with CharmWorks. So the underlying software environment that's being used by Klaus to do 100 million atom simulations from first principles. So we're talking about almost within an order of magnitude or two of being able to simulate entire life forms from first principles, because it is chemistry and it is molecular dynamics, and these are the ingredients that go into this. So on the machines that we have now, we're just this close from being able to do that, but meanwhile we can simulate important parts of life forms, the cellular organelles, the chromatophore, for example. How does photosynthesis actually work in a cell, or how does the HIV virus operate, especially when you are bringing new drugs in it that might potentially fight the HIV virus only and not other bits of life that might be inside your body. So Klaus is able to now simulate the drug interactions with the HIV virus from first principles, and this just wasn't even thinkable a few years ago because of machines like Blue Waters that we have. This is back to the materials genome. This is this concept of, in slightly different words. Merle was calling it convergence. I used to call it grand challenge communities, where there are these grand challenge problems that are so big and they're so complex that you can't do it with one community, like the physics community, or with this computer science community, or with the software community, or with the HPC community. You need to bring them together. And so these problems really require at least representatives from multiple communities to be present. And this is the whole idea behind the materials genome, was actually announced by President Obama at Carnegie Mellon University in 2011. It was a great day because I'd been working on this from within the NSF for about a year, and to have it announced at such a high level was very exciting. And this was the idea, finding ways to combine theory and computation, instrumentation, and data all on an equal footing, with cyber infrastructure as the key enabler, and then policy around the data so it could be shareable, not only across groups, but directly into industry. And so I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Potential for some new projects that we're working on here at the University of Illinois, and particularly at NCSA, that we'd like to talk to you to see how we might work together, particularly on data projects going forward. All right, so I'll skip over that. So with all this as a backdrop, I've been here at NCSA, and I just had come from this idea of building a new university all around innovation, and I'm trying to build these ingredients into NCSA. So we've done a lot of strategic planning, and so NCSA is already at the top of its game, but what can we do new that will take it to the next level? And so this is where I really would like to get some feedback from you during the day today. So we've done a lot of strategic planning, and NCSA going forward will be around not just the supercomputing, or not just the data services, or not just the research, but somehow the collaborations, the integration around complex problems. And I think we'll have a lot more capacity to work with the private sector program partners going forward as we develop this, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So that's just a reminder. We're moving from individual investigators to what's called the end of science by Wired magazine a few years ago. They said, science is over, science as we know it is over, now it'll be about data, computation, and so on. So it was very sort of over-the-top article, but it's true. The methodologies as we know them are changing profoundly and dramatically, and then the collaborations. And so those are the two trends. And this comes to Merle's favorite word of his last talk, convergence. So Merle didn't just pick that word out of a hat. It's a theme that we see in many ways, including in one of the most recent National Academy reports, which if you haven't seen it, I urge you to take a look at it. I'll have a quote from the executive summary, but it just came out last year, led by a guy named Joe DeSimone. So if you work in material science, he's at the University of North Carolina. You might know Joe, and he's in fact just in the middle of forming a new company for 3D printing, and there was a big story on the BBC about how his new company might be able to allow 3D printing 1,000 times faster than any other process that had been developed before. And Joe was very excited about this, but he was also on the Math and Physical Sciences Advisory Board at NSF, and spoke very cogently about the importance of industrial involvement at the NSF, and also about diversity, and then the integration of different kinds of talent that were needed in order to address complex problems. And this report just lives and breathes that, and you can't read it, but it says, facilitating transdisciplinary integration of life sciences, physical sciences, engineering, and beyond. And so this is sort of a new Bible for me, and I think for many universities moving forward. How do you create the environment so that these different things can be integrated to really address the complex problems that we're faced with? So with all of this, we've gone through a strategic planning process, and we have a new strategic plan for NCSA, which is not just going to be a document that sits on a shelf, but we're going to go undertake a process now of how we actually organize NCSA to best respond to these challenges. And so the three key points that are in our strategic plan, I would hand you copies, except it's still in draft form, but within a month it's probably going to be ready to share with people. But these are the three key points. The first one is about increasingly complex problem require this integration ... in what is now termed convergence, and that's drawing right out of that report. And then the second one is that there's this revolution due to the profound growth in computing and data, and they need to be brought together, and a place like NCSA can bring them together like no other place, because we have the largest supercomputer, we have the largest mass store system, we have the fastest networks in the building, across the campus, and to the city of Chicago, over 400 gigabits per second. So we have capacity here that can be harnessed to do this kind of work in this age. And it has a lot to do with workflow, and I was pleased to see Merle saying workflow is king. We're going to develop an environment where it is much easier to connect a high-performance computation with a high-performance data analysis with data that comes off of an electron microscope or an advanced photon source of an argon and so on. We're building this environment where all of these things can be brought together, and the environment where intellectually the different disciplines can be brought together. And then the third one, and I really learned this even at NSF, but especially at my experience in Russia, where the entire reason for being for that new university, a brand new university, was it had to become more of an engine for economic development. And so NCSA is going to take that to heart. So just a couple of quotes from this report, the National Academy report from on convergence. It's a culture shift for academic organizations, and it's taken many centuries for universities to develop traditions around the physics department, the English department, the math department, and so on. And those things take a long time to change. But this report is saying, wake up, we need to create new academic structures that brings them together much more nimbly. And so we've had discussions with the Vice Chancellor for Research here, Peter Schiffer, who I report to, and Peter has about 6 or 7 really strong research institutes that report to him, and he's thinking about how he can bring them together to make the University of Illinois a much more nimble engine for discovery and for economic development. And we're having many discussions about that, but it's along the same theme of convergence that I was talking about. So, therefore, NCSA is going to help the university respond to these 3 challenges, just the same ones I mentioned before. So, I wanted to point out this slide again, because it was a great experience for me working, but in a really complex environment, let's say in Russia, where if you don't speak Russian, there's one disadvantage to working in Russia. But then, on the other hand, there was great opportunity. So that dome there on the left is the famous dome at MIT. So you might think of MIT as one of the world's best universities. And it's a university that's fantastic at cranking out economic development and innovation, just spews out of MIT. And that's why Russia came to MIT and said, will you help us build something new in Russia? And then MIT would never do something like this because it would be a distraction, unless it was really important to them to figure out how can they do what they're doing at home even better. So they could use Russia as a sort of an experimental environment to create a new environment, and that's a rendering of the campus that I was helping to build. Each one of those buildings in that big ring there would be one of these centers for research, education, and innovation. And so the idea was that there would be no physics department there. There'd be no chemistry department. There'd be no computer science department. There wouldn't be a business school. But they would all be integrated in every single one of those sheds, as we called them, in those buildings, and each of those would be a center of about, say, 200 people with faculty, students, staff, companies all working together around complex problems. And so the entire university was built around this complex problem-solving environment with a computing and data environment that would allow them to integrate like never before. And that's the basic concept of that university. So I spent a year and a half working on that, and then I was pulled back to the States and to the university here, and after looking at and thinking about this, I thought this place can be better than that place because it's got all the ingredients already there, very, very strong. So we just have to figure out how to organize them. So, moving towards this new NCSA organization. So we have these 3 parts of our strategic plan. That is to build these, the Center for Transdisciplinary Convergence, faculty-led groups where we'll bring in, say, 4 to 6 faculty with a number of grad students and postdocs that will power that unit, and staff integrated in some way. We're just at the beginning phases of creating this environment. And then in the middle, there's this integrated computing, data, and software networking environment, more deeply integrated than before. Of course, we're integrated, we have high-speed networks, but really thinking through, if you want to address a complex problem that has visualization, data, computing needs, software, how do you bring them together in a more nimble way, in a more deeply integrated way? So we're thinking this through, and we're not the only ones. I'm on the visiting committees at Argonne National Lab and at Oak Ridge National Lab, and they've got people focusing just on this sort of thing as well. So we're thinking a lot. We see it as an international trend, but I think we can do this extremely well here. And then economic development as co-equal with the other 2 for the 3 key strategic goals of NCSA. So of course, the private sector program is embedded in this environment. So the elements are here, but they're not yet developed out the way that they will be. And so any comments that you have on how we might do this best that would be supportive of what your interests are, I'm very interested in hearing it. So we have these advanced production technologies. The biggest production supercomputer in the country, the Blue Water system. We have the iForge system, which is dedicated completely for the economic development purposes of the private sector program. The Exceed project, again, production level digital services across the country at a national level, but managed out of NCSA, so we have all this expertise as well. So those are production level services. We're going to be building some things that I'll tell you about in just a minute. We're in the middle of a thing called the National Data Service, NDS, and we have started this up, just an initiative out of our vision and our energy for this, currently funded by individuals, not by individual groups with their own funding, not yet funded by the National Science Foundation, but I'll come to that in a minute. I think there's very good opportunity there for that to happen. And a new thing called the Big Data Hub, BD Hub. And there's a current open solicitation from NSF that is unusually aimed at connection with private sector partners. And I'll come to that in a minute. And we're in the stage of just beginning to figure out what that proposal is supposed to be. So it's a great opportunity for any of you, all of you, potentially to be engaged in that. So, but the data activities will be one of the integrating factors for this networking, this computing environment. Another layer which we currently have, but we want to beef it up, is called the Innovative Systems Lab. And so the Innovative Systems Lab is where the most advanced, the most experimental technologies can be deployed. So you'll know, if you're interested in seeing what's coming down the road a couple of years, to get early environment to do some early development on. For example, 10 years ago, NVIDIA worked with us to deploy advanced GPUs before they were really used as engines for scientific computation. And through that work with some of the faculty and staff here, with Vlad and with Wenmei and others, we began, or before I was here, began to experiment with them, and they are now GPUs, the engines for many, many scientific computation systems across the world. And that really emanated in large part, I think, out of the early work that was done here at NCSA. So we're doing this again. We want to reinvent the world based on new technologies that are coming out after that. The CSE program. There is a program, one of the oldest in the country, formed in the early 90s, called Computational Science and Engineering. It's very, very mature on this campus in terms of the knowledge and the ability to do computational science and engineering. And there are hundreds of students in this program across many departments in the engineering college and beyond. There are literally hundreds of faculty that are associated with it. And so we're talking with the CSE program about how to combine forces at NCSA to sort of do more development, more training, more engineering, computational science and engineering. So with all of this, we'll be bringing in more students, postdocs, staff, and facilities that we can bring to the PSP program going forward. And this brings advanced projects. So we'd love to get your ideas on how we could harness all this capacity as we're building it so we can create the right structures that we can bring it to you, and we can understand, we can learn from you as well. So yesterday I mentioned to some of you that when I was here many years ago in the early 90s, I was doing black hole collisions, and you might think that's just completely divorced from anything you might be interested in, but I had a project with Schlumberger, very specifically, because we both had to deal with hyperbolic systems. They were sending sound waves down into the Earth to try to figure out what was down there, any oil reserves down there. We were dealing with gravitational waves. The equations were similar. We had to do high-performance computing, so we worked together, actually, on automatic code generation for hyperbolic systems, and it was a fantastic collaboration that helped both of us. So the point is, all of these research groups that I'll show you pictures of in a second here, they're led by these people initially. So Gabrielle Allen, Athol Kemble in physics and astronomy, these are all faculty. Earth and environment led by Xiaowen Wang. Materials and manufacturing led by Narayan Alluru. Bioinformatics and health sciences by Victor Yonganil, and culture and society led by Donna Cox, who's an art professor. And she's the only art professor I've ever seen come to an astrophysics talk and ask about the details of the code that was used to simulate a trillion particles in the universe, forming galaxies and stars and so on. So she's just the kind of interesting, advanced, and very broad people we have here at NCSA. So what do these people do? So each of these groups imagine as being an engine for working on research and development projects, not only for themselves, but they'll all have guidelines on how it is that they can interact, for example, on the innovation side to sort of cross this valley of death that Merle was talking about. And how can we do this? So Alluru, for example, runs the CSE program and has proposed things for NSF Science and Technology Center for digital manufacturing. So that's just an example of the kind of big thinking that we have here, and that would of course be of interest to many of you if that particular proposal was not successful. Those are hard to get, but we're very strong faculty here, and we'll be able to do a lot more things like that. So just other examples, Victor's involved in HPC Bio and the NIH BD2K, that's Big Data to Knowledge, and the National Data Service activities, just examples. Gabrielle's been working on software toolkits and worked with a lot of companies, in fact a lot of the vendors in the room, as well as with other companies, HDF and so on, as well as fluid dynamics companies. So a lot of that work's been going on for years. Donna does a lot of advanced visualization techniques and advanced collaborative environments. Athol is working on things like the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope and then toolkits for doing visualization and so on. And Xiaowen has a project called Cyber GIS, involving dozens of faculty and people across the national communities about how you would use GIS systems, for example, and apply that directly to earth and environment, agriculture, and so on. Sensors deployed, understanding how that might impact crop yields and so on. Excuse me. So just an example how companies can be connected into these things. So in many cases there have been projects over the years. Caterpillar's been here since the beginning and worked with Donna in advanced collaborative environments in the cave and 3D visualization systems and so on for years. Mayo Clinic working with Victor Cray. Donna has a project now with the NSF funded specifically to do visualizations of petascale simulations and so on. And Agrable and so on. So you can see there are many, many areas where the companies here could build in and work with us. So this is just a sort of an advertisement about the data project I was telling you about, the National Data Service. I would just urge you to take a Google for the National Data Service Consortium and you'll find this website. We're getting a lot of momentum. We have dozens of partners across the country, most of the supercomputing centers, and we're just, as Merle said before, we don't have funding for this right now, so we're just standing up and doing it. We're creating a thing called National Data Service Labs that we're federating across San Diego Supercomputing Center, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, NCSA, Argonne National Lab, Notre Dame, and Cardiff University, where we're just going to create an open hosting environment where people could experiment, discover each other's services, and link them together. And that's the laboratory environment. So it'll be open to people to just get on and play with and do your thing with it and see what others are doing. So that's the one initial thing we're starting. Now, I'm almost done, Merle. I don't know how many minutes I'm over, but I want to conclude with this thing which is going on right now. It's called the Big Data Regional Innovation Hubs. And NSF just announced this a few months ago. And they did something I thought was actually fairly crazy. They said, we're going to have 4 meetings. We're calling them charrettes. And this meeting is by invitation only, so you can come if we invite you. And at the end of this meeting, and they had them in different regions, one in the Midwest in Ann Arbor, Michigan, one in the West in Salt Lake City, one in the South in Raleigh, North Carolina, and one in the Northeast, and I forget where it was, it might have been at RPI in Albany or something like that. So anyway, one per region, and at the end of the day, we want one team to emerge to say, we're going to propose something, and I'll tell you what they're asking for, and that's the overarching vision of this, of what these hubs would do. We want one team to lead it, and we'll fund one per region. And so we went to Ann Arbor, and we actually emerged as the leader of the Midwest Big Data Hub, and we are already in collaboration and discussions with the leaders of the other regions. And so we're going to basically try to stitch together a set of data hubs, and we get to define what they do. And they are in almost every line of this. I've never seen an NSF solicitation like this. It says something about partnerships with the private sector, spurring economic development, increasing productivity, and so on. So that's from the first paragraph of the solicitation. So then here's from, it says potential activities for big data hubs include driving successful pilot programs for big data, emerging big data technology by acting as a matchmaker between academic, industry, and community stakeholders. And this room is a perfect example of those partners, and so we should figure something out. Engaging stakeholders across the region based on shared interest and industry sector engagement to share best practices, to set standards for data access, data formats, and so on. And then increasing the speed and volume of technology transfer. And these are just directly out of the solicitation. So private sector engagement is going to be critical to the success of this program, and I think we're in a fantastic position to talk about what that would be. So we've already had a couple of meetings of just the academic partners to get started, along with a few others, like for example the UI Labs at the university, in Chicago, which is a University Industry Laboratory, and a number of you are already partners with UI Labs there. And so our concept is that we will, by the way, this provides very little funding for now. It provides money for a full-time person to build and coordinate these communities over time. And then they promise additional funding actions for particular spokes, as they call them, which would be along any dimensions that we define, but these are ones that we've already got some working groups to start to think about: food, energy, and water, digital precision agriculture, including sensors and so on, health sciences, life sciences, biomedical, transportation, of course, very important in Michigan, and Michigan is one of our partners, urban science and smart cities, business analytics. There were some groups that really wanted to have a project, in not just a project, but build communities around business analytics. And then we have these things called rings, which sort of cut across all the spokes, which would be data services and data science and education. So we're in the process now of just beginning to flesh this out. And so my last point of my entire talk is opportunity awaits. So I hope today we can get some sense of whether this would be interesting to you in this particular project. We're just in the formative stages, and I think it's going to be a multi-year run-up at NSF. I anticipate it'll be at the level of many tens of millions of dollars over time from NSF, but they're interested in, they said, look, this isn't just NSF. We're trying to create a framework into which NIH, Department of Transportation, National Institutes of Standards and Technologies, any federal agency or cabinet department could fund activities directly into these hubs. And so they want that sort of an environment. That's it. Thank you.